Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. The foghorn here on the Maine coast is my constant companion, a deep, lonely boom that echoes for miles. But sometimes, on the thickest nights, it makes a different sound, a long, mournful cry, like a wail in pain. That's when you know something has answered its call. You don't look out the windows. You just go down to the heavy oak door at the base of the tower and slide the third iron bolt into place. Not the top two, always the third. You do it quietly, and you hope whatever is coming up from the surf doesn't hear you. My name is Ethan Thorne, and 6 months ago I was teaching high school chemistry in Portland. Decent apartment, steady paycheck, a girlfriend named Rebecca who made sourdough bread every Sunday. Normal life. Then my father died, sudden heart attack while checking his lobster traps near Pemaquid Point, and left me his house in Friendship, along with debts that made my teaching salary look like pocket change. The lighthouse keeper position at Burnt Island Light Station paid 3 times what I made at school. The Coast Guard listing mentioned overnight maintenance duties and storm monitoring, but nothing about rules. Nothing about the third bolt, or why the previous keeper, old Henrik Johansson, had quit after 42 years without giving notice. "Just needs someone reliable," said Miriam Colby at the town office, sliding the paperwork across her desk. Her fingers were stained purple from the blueberry farm she ran summers. Henrik was getting on in years. Place needs fresh blood. Fresh blood. If I'd known what that phrase would come to mean, I might have stayed in Portland and sold my soul to the creditors instead. Burnt Island sits 3 miles off the Friendship coast, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that disappears completely at high tide. The lighthouse itself dates back to 1832. A white tower, red roof. Keeper's house built from local granite that turns black when it rains, which it does, often. The Coast Guard automated the light years ago, but they still needed someone on site for weather reporting and maintenance. What they didn't mention was the notebook Henrik left behind, tucked between the marine radio and a rusted coffee tin full of spare batteries. His handwriting was careful, practiced, like a man who'd been taking notes for decades. "Rules for night duty. Follow exactly," read the cover. I'd laughed at first. Rules for lighthouse keeping. Check the weather instruments. Monitor the radio. Make sure the light stays operational. How complicated could it be? Then the first thick fog rolled in 3 weeks after I started, and I learned exactly why Henrik Johansson had written everything down. Why his hands shook whenever he came to town for supplies. Why Miriam Colby had looked relieved when I signed the contract, like she'd been holding her breath for months. The Maine coast keeps its secrets well, but some secrets don't want to stay buried beneath the cold Atlantic. Some of them come back when the fog gets thick enough, when the foghorn makes that wrong sound, when something old and hungry remembers the taste of warm blood on barnacle-crusted rocks. Henrik's rules exist for a reason. I just wish he'd explained what happens if you break them. Henrik's notebook had 7 rules written in fading blue ink, each one numbered and dated from different years. Some entries had been crossed out and rewritten, like he'd learned through trial and error what worked. Rule 1. When the fog rolls in thick enough to muffle the waves, lock the third bolt on the main door. Never the first 2. The third one makes a different sound when it slides home. Rule 2. If you hear someone calling your name from outside between midnight and 4 a.m., check the radio log first. If no boats have reported distress, don't answer. They already know you're listening. Rule 3. Keep the tower light burning all night, but if it starts to flicker in patterns of 3, turn it off for exactly 90 seconds. Count slowly, Turn it back on before you reach 91. Rule 4. Never shine a flashlight directly into the water after 2 a.m. Peripheral light only. What you see swimming might follow the beam back to shore. Rule 5. If you find wet footprints leading from the dock to the lighthouse that aren't yours, sprinkle salt in each print. Work backwards from the door to the water. Don't miss any. Rule 6. The foghorn sounds on its automated schedule. If it sounds off schedule, someone else is operating it. Go to the radio room and stay there until dawn. Rule 7. Trust the seagulls. When they all leave at once, something is coming that birds won't tolerate. Below the rules, Henrik had written a single line in different ink, shakier handwriting. Been keeping this light for 42 years. These rules kept me alive. Break them at your peril. H.J. I'd read through them twice that first week, filing them away as the paranoid ramblings of an old man who'd spent too many years alone with the ocean. Maine coast bred eccentric lighthouse keepers, the way other places bred conspiracy theorists. Occupational hazard. The first night I needed the rules was October 15th. I remember because I'd been marking the date on a calendar, counting down days until my first paycheck would arrive. The weather report called for heavy fog moving in from the northeast, visibility dropping to near zero by 10 p.m. I was updating the log when I noticed the gulls. They'd been perched on the rocks around the island all evening, making their usual racket. Then, sometime around 9:30, they just stopped. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had thrown a switch. Rule 7. Trust the seagulls. I stepped outside the keeper's house and looked around. Every bird was gone. The only sound was waves hitting the rocks below and the distant rumble of fog approaching like a gray wall. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 10 minutes. That's when the real fog hit. Not the wispy stuff that drifts in most evenings, but a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed everything beyond the lighthouse's bays. Standing at my kitchen window, I couldn't see the dock 20 yards away. Rule 1. When the fog rolls in thick enough to muffle the waves, lock the third bolt. Henrik hadn't been paranoid. The waves were muffled, like the fog absorbed sound itself. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the tower's main entrance. The heavy oak door had 3 iron bolts running vertically along its frame. The top 2 were already secured. I'd locked those when I first arrived, standard security. The third bolt sat lower, different from the others. Older. Its iron was darker, almost black, and when I touched it, the metal felt warm despite the sudden cold. I slid it into place. Henrik was right. It made a different sound. Not the sharp click of the other bolts, but a deep, resonant thud that seemed to vibrate through the lighthouse's foundation. That's when I heard my name. Ethan. Faint, coming from somewhere outside. Ethan Thorne. My hands went still on the bolt. Who would be out there in this fog? The causeway was underwater by now, and no boats would attempt a landing in zero visibility. Rule 2. If you hear someone calling your name from outside between midnight and 4 a.m., check the radio log first. It was only 10:47 p.m., but I went to the radio anyway. The emergency channel crackled with static. No distress calls. No boat traffic reported in the past 6 hours. The nearest Coast Guard station at Rockland had logged nothing. Ethan. Closer now, right outside the door. The voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. Male, middle-aged, with the flat vowels of someone born in Maine. It reminded me of my father, though Dad had been dead 4 months. I stood in the radio room, watching the frequency dial, trying to convince myself that fog played tricks with sound. Maybe someone was calling from the mainland, and the thick air carried their voice across the water. Maybe I was hearing things, "Ethan, I know you're in there." The voice came from directly outside the door now. Not shouting, but speaking in a normal conversational tone that somehow carried clearly through the oak and iron. Whoever was out there knew exactly where I stood. My hand reached for the door handle before I caught myself. Henrik's rule echoed in my head. "They already know you're listening." I stayed in the radio room until dawn, watching the fog slowly lift with the rising sun. When I finally opened the door, I found wet footprints on the granite steps. Barefoot impressions leading from the dock straight to where I had been standing. The prints were still damp, despite 6 hours of exposure to ocean air. I should have told someone about the footprints. Called the Coast Guard, reported trespassing, filed some kind of official report. Instead, I found myself in Fletcher's general store the next morning, standing in the coffee aisle like a tourist, trying to work up the nerve to ask Miriam Colby about Henrik. "You settling in all right out there?" She appeared beside me, arms full of canned corn and local honey. Miriam moved through her own store, like she knew where every item lived, which she probably did after 30 years of running the place. Fine. Quiet. I picked up a bag of dark roast, pretending to read the label. Henrik left some notes. Maintenance stuff. Wondered if you knew why he really quit. Her expression shifted. Not quite worry, but something close to it. Henrik was particular about that lighthouse. Took his job seriously. Maybe too seriously toward the end. What do you mean? She glanced around the store. 2 other customers browsed the shelves, lobstermen picking up supplies before heading out. He started talking about things, strange things. Folks thought the isolation was getting to him. What kind of things? Claims about visitors. People coming to the island who shouldn't have been able to get there. Dead people. She lowered her voice. His own brother drowned off those rocks in '78. Henrik swore he saw him walking around the lighthouse last winter. The coffee bag crinkled in my hands. His brother? Magnus Johansson lost his boat in a winter storm. They never found the body. Miriam shifted the honey jars in her arms. Henrik got it in his head that Magnus was still out there somewhere. Started leaving food on the dock, talking to empty air. That's when folks knew it was time for him to retire. I paid for the coffee and drove back to the causeway, thinking about Magnus Johansson. About wet footprints and voices in the fog calling familiar names. Maybe Henrik hadn't been talking to empty air after all. That night, I made sure to review the rules again before sunset. The weather forecast called for clear skies, no fog, light winds from the southwest. Perfect conditions for a quiet evening of routine maintenance. The tower light came on automatically at 7:43 p.m. I was in the radio room updating the weather log when I noticed something wrong with the beam. It wasn't rotating smoothly. Instead, it flickered in short, rhythmic bursts. 3 quick flashes, pause, 3 more flashes. Rule 3. If it starts to flicker in patterns of 3, turn it off for exactly 90 seconds. I climbed the spiral stairs to the lamp room, my footsteps echoing off the iron steps. The lighthouse used a modern LED array now instead of the old Fresno lens, but the setup was simple enough. I found the manual override switch and clicked it off. Darkness swallowed the island completely. No moon tonight, just stars scattered across black water. I started counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Standing in the lamp room, I could see the entire coastline of Friendship twinkling in the distance. Warm yellow squares of kitchen windows, the red beacon at the harbor entrance, headlights moving along Route 220. Normal life happening just 3 miles away, close enough to swim to if the tide was right. 23 Mississippi, 24 Mississippi. That's when I saw the lights in the water. They moved beneath the surface, pale blue-green, like bioluminescent plankton but much brighter. At first I thought they might be boat lights, but they moved wrong, gliding in smooth curves instead of following the choppy motion of waves. 47 Mississippi, 48 Mississippi. The lights rose closer to the surface. I could make out shapes now. Human shapes walking along the sea floor with slow, measured steps. They carried the light with them somehow, each figure glowing from within like a deep-sea creature. 61 Mississippi, 62 Mississippi. Rule 4. Never shine a flashlight directly into the water after 2 a.m. What you see swimming might follow the beam back to shore. It was only 9:15 p.m., but something told me the rule applied to any light source. I forced myself to look away from the water, focusing on the countdown instead. 87 Mississippi, 88 Mississippi. Just before I reached 90, I heard them breaking the surface, not splashing like swimmers, but emerging with barely a ripple. Footsteps on the dock below, wet, deliberate sounds on wooden planks. 90 Mississippi. I flipped the switch. The lighthouse beam blazed back to life, rotating in its normal pattern. When I looked down at the dock, nothing was there. Just empty wooden planks gleaming under the restored light. But the footsteps continued. Multiple sets now, moving up the path from the dock toward the lighthouse. I grabbed Henrik's notebook and headed for the radio room, locking the door behind me. Rule 5. If you find wet footprints leading from the dock to the lighthouse that aren't yours, sprinkle salt in each print. I didn't have salt in the radio room. The kitchen was downstairs, which meant I'd have to leave the safety of this small, locked space and venture into the main part of the lighthouse. The footsteps had stopped outside the building, but that didn't mean they were gone. I waited 10 minutes before making my move. The radio crackled with routine Coast Guard chatter, weather updates, fishing vessel check-ins, nothing urgent. Outside, complete silence. The kitchen salt container sat on the counter where I'd left it that morning. I grabbed it and headed for the main door, moving as quietly as possible. Through the small window, I could see wet prints on the granite steps. Lots of them. Some looked human. Others didn't. The third bolt was still secured. Whatever had come up from the water hadn't tried to enter the lighthouse. They just gathered outside, leaving their marks on the stone. I opened the door slowly, listening for any sound. Nothing but waves and wind. The prints were fresh, still damp despite the cool night air. I started with the ones closest to the door, sprinkling salt into each depression. The granules hissed when they hit the wet stone, like water hitting a hot pan. Working backward toward the dock, I counted at least 15 different prints. Most were human feet, but some showed webbed toes or elongated digits that didn't match any anatomy I knew. One set looked like a child's feet, small and narrow, but the depth of the impression suggested something much heavier than a child could ever be. The last print sat right at the edge of the dock. As I poured salt into it, the granules began to glow with the same blue-green light I'd seen underwater. For a moment, the print filled with phosphorescent seawater that bubbled and steamed before evaporating completely. When I looked up, something watched me from just beneath the surface of the water. Pale face, dark eyes, features that looked almost familiar. It sank back into the depths before I could get a clear look, but I had the sinking feeling it would be back. Walking back to the lighthouse, I noticed something Henrik hadn't mentioned in his rules. The wet prints I'd treated with salt were gone, but new ones were already appearing on the path behind me. Smaller prints, following my footsteps exactly. I locked the third bolt and didn't sleep until sunrise. 3 days passed without incident. I started to think maybe the salt had worked, that whatever came up from the water had gotten the message and moved on. I was wrong. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when I called my sister Kate in Bangor. She taught 4th grade at the Down East school and usually answered on the second ring. This time, her phone went straight to voicemail. "Hey, it's Ethan. Just checking in. Call me back when you get this." She called back 20 minutes later, sounding confused. "I didn't get any missed calls. My phone's been right here all morning." I checked my call log. According to my phone, I dialed her number and had a conversation that lasted 8 minutes. But Kate insisted she'd been in a staff meeting and hadn't spoken to anyone. "Maybe it's the Lighthouse messing with cell towers," she suggested. "You know how spotty service gets out on the islands." But I knew what I'd heard. A voice that sounded exactly like Kate, telling me about her students' Halloween projects and complaining about the new principal. We'd discussed Dad's old fishing boat and whether I should sell it. Except Kate said none of that conversation had happened. That afternoon, I found Henrik's phone number written on a scrap of paper tucked behind the radio. He lived in a nursing home in Rockland now, according to Miriam. I called from the Lighthouse's landline. "Henrik, this is Ethan Thorne. I'm the new keeper at Burnt Island." Silence stretched so long, I thought the connection had dropped. Then, "You're calling from the Lighthouse?" "Yes, sir. I wanted to ask about your rules. Some things have been happening. Don't talk about it over the phone." His voice carried the weight of genuine fear. "They listen to the calls. Meet me tomorrow at Wass's Hot Dogs in Rockland. Noon. Don't mention this place again until we're face to face." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, wondering what Henrik meant by "they listen," but his tone left no room for doubt. Whatever was happening at Burnt Island Light Station, it was serious enough to make a 42-year veteran lighthouse keeper afraid of discussing it over a telephone line. That night, I decided to test Rule 4. The weather was clear, visibility excellent, water calm as glass. Perfect conditions for seeing what lurked beneath the surface. Just after midnight, I grabbed a powerful LED flashlight and positioned myself on the dock. Rule 4. Never shine a flashlight directly into the water after 2 a.m. What you see swimming might follow the beam back to shore. It was only 12:15 a.m. I had almost 2 hours before the rule kicked in. Surely Henrik hadn't meant all night, just after 2 a.m. specifically. I aimed the beam into the dark water and switched it on. The light penetrated maybe 15 feet down, illuminating empty water and scattered rocks on the seafloor. Normal ocean bottom, nothing threatening. Fish darted away from the sudden brightness. Seaweed swayed in the current. I kept the light moving, sweeping back and forth in wide arcs. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, until the beam passed over something large, resting near a cluster of boulders about 20 feet out. A boat. Old wooden hull, maybe 30 feet long, resting upright on the bottom like it had been carefully placed there instead of sunk. Even through the water, I could make out the name painted on the stern. Astrid's Dream. Magnus Johansson's boat. The one that was lost in the winter storm of 1978. I kept the light trained on the wreck, studying its condition. After 45 years underwater, the boat should have been broken apart, scattered by storms, eaten by marine borers. Instead, it looked nearly intact. Preserved. That's when I saw movement inside the cabin. A figure sat at what must have been the wheel, hunched over like someone sleeping. The flashlight beam wasn't strong enough to make out details, but the shape was definitely human. As I watched, it slowly turned toward the light. Even through 15 feet of salt water, I could see its face clearly. Magnus Johansson, exactly as he appeared in the old photograph hanging in Fletcher's general store. Same weathered features, same wool cap, same heavy jacket. Except his skin had the blue-white pallor of someone who'd been underwater for decades. He raised one hand and waved at me, a slow, deliberate gesture. Then he pointed toward the shore. I switched off the flashlight and stumbled backward, nearly falling off the dock. When I looked at my watch, the display showed 2:03 a.m. Somehow, almost 2 hours had passed while I stared at the wreck. I'd lost time, standing there in the beam's glow, completely unaware of the minutes ticking by. Rule 4 wasn't about timing, it was about duration. The longer you looked, the deeper you got pulled in, and something down there had noticed my attention. The foghorn sounded 3 times in quick succession, but according to the automated schedule, it shouldn't sound again until 6 a.m. Rule 6. If it sounds off schedule, someone else is operating it. Go to the radio room and stay there until dawn. I ran for the lighthouse, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The radio room felt like the safest place in the building. Small, enclosed, with a solid door and no windows facing the water. I locked myself in and tried to think rationally about what I'd just witnessed. Maybe the boat wasn't the Astrid's dream. Maybe it was some other wreck, and my imagination had filled in the details. Maybe the figure I'd seen was just debris or kelp moving in the current. Maybe the lost time was just my mind playing tricks, the way it did sometimes when you focus too intently on something. But the foghorn kept sounding. 3 blasts, pause, 3 blasts, over and over. Not the normal single blast that warned ships of the rocky coastline, but a different pattern entirely, like Morse code. I found a pencil and started writing down the pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Someone was using the lighthouse's foghorn to send a distress signal. The radio crackled. Emergency frequency. Someone broadcasting in clear distress. Mayday, mayday. This is fishing vessel Astrid's Dream. Position approximately 3 miles southeast of Burnt Island Light. We're taking on water, engine failure, requesting immediate assistance. My hands shook as I reached for the microphone. The voice on the radio sounded like Magnus Johansson, exactly as he might have sounded in 1978, calling for help as his boat went down in a winter storm. Coast Guard Rockland, this is Burnt Island Light Station. Be advised, no vessel visible from lighthouse position. Repeat, no vessel in distress observed. Static. Then Magnus's voice again. Burnt Island Light, we can see your beam. We're right below you. Send help. Water's coming in fast. I looked out the radio room's single small window. The water around the lighthouse was empty. No boat, no lights, no signs of distress. Just black ocean reflecting the lighthouse beam. Astrid's Dream, this is Burnt Island Light. I don't see any vessel. Can you confirm your position? We're sinking, Magnus replied, his voice getting fainter. Tell my brother Henrik. Tell him I tried to make it home. Tell him the others are down here too. All the boats that got lost. We're all down here, waiting. The transmission cut to static. I tried calling back, but got no response. The Coast Guard frequency remained silent. Apparently they weren't hearing any of this. The foghorn stopped sounding. Outside, dawn was still 3 hours away. I stayed in the radio room until sunrise, listening to occasional bursts of static that almost sounded like voices. Fragments of conversations, names I recognized from old obituaries in the Friendship newspaper. Fishermen who'd been lost at sea over the decades, all apparently broadcasting from somewhere beneath the black water around Burnt Island. When the sun finally rose, I found wet footprints all around the lighthouse. Not just human prints this time, but gouges in the granite that looked like they'd been made by something heavy, being dragged across the rock. The marks led from the water to every window on the ground floor, as if something had been checking each opening, looking for a way inside. At the base of the lighthouse door, someone had left a gift, a piece of driftwood carved into the shape of a small boat. When I picked it up, water dripped from the wood despite the dry morning air. Astrid's dream was carved into its side in tiny, precise letters. I drove to Rockland that morning to meet Henrik, leaving the carved boat on my kitchen table. By the time I got back that evening, it had moved to the windowsill, positioned so it faced the water. I hadn't touched it. Wass's Hot Dog sits on Route 1 in Rockland, the kind of place that's been serving the same menu since the 1960s. I found Henrik in a corner booth, hunched over a cup of coffee that looked like it had been sitting there for hours. He'd aged since the newspaper photo at Fletcher's store. Thinner, more fragile, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. "You came," he said when I slid into the seat across from him. "Good. That means you're taking the rules seriously." "They work," I admitted, "but I need to understand what I'm dealing with. Last night I saw..." "Don't!" Henrik's hand shot across the table, gripping my wrist. His fingers were surprisingly strong. "Not here. Too many ears." He glanced around the restaurant. A few lobstermen occupied the counter stools, discussing trap locations and bait prices. An elderly couple shared a plate of onion rings. Normal people having normal conversations. But Henrik acted like we were surrounded by spies. "Let's walk," he said, dropping a $5 bill next to his untouched coffee. We ended up at the breakwater, the long granite pier that protected Rockland Harbor from Atlantic storms. Henrik led me to the far end, where the lighthouse keeper's house from the old Rockland breakwater light still stood. Abandoned now, windows boarded up, but solid enough to block the wind. 42 years I kept that light, Henrik began, staring out at the islands scattered across Penobscot Bay. 42 years of following those rules, and I never lost a single person. Not one. Lost a person? That's what the lighthouse is really for. Not ships. They've got GPS now, radar, all kinds of modern navigation. The light is for the ones who come back from the water. It keeps them oriented, gives them something to follow. Without it, they'd wander the coast forever, pulling others down with them. A fishing boat chugged past us, heading back to harbor with the day's catch. Henrik watched it until it disappeared behind the breakwater. "My great-grandfather built that lighthouse in 1832, he continued. "The Johansons have been keeping it ever since. Each generation passes down the rules, adds new ones when needed. But I was the last. No children, no family left except Magnus and he." Henrik's voice caught. "He went down in the storm of 78. "I saw his boat," I said quietly. Henrik nodded like he'd been expecting this. "The Astrid's dream. She's been sitting down there for 45 years, waiting for someone to notice. Magnus won't leave her. Can't leave her. None of them can. None of them. Every fisherman who ever died in these waters. Every sailor. Every lobsterman. Every summer kid who fell off a dock and drowned. The cold water preserves them, but it changes them too. They remember being alive, remember having families on shore, so they try to come back." Henrik pulled a worn leather wallet from his jacket pocket and extracted a black and white photograph. It showed two young men standing beside a small fishing boat, both grinning at the camera. Brothers, obviously. They have the same weathered features, the same steady eyes. Magnus and me, 1976. He was 28, just married, talking about starting a family. Bought that boat with his savings. Planned to work the lobster grounds between here and Monhegan. Good fishing out there, but dangerous water. Lots of ledges and tide rips. What happened to him? February storm. Worst one we'd seen in decades. Coast Guard told everyone to stay in port, but Magnus had bills to pay. New boat, new wife. Pride getting in the way of common sense. He went out anyway. Henrik tucked the photograph back into his wallet. Found pieces of the Astrid's Dream washed up on Burnt Island 3 days later. Wheelhouse door, some rope, part of the stern rail. But never found Magnus. Search and rescue looked for a week. Dragged hooks along the bottom, sent divers down to every ledge between here and Nova Scotia. Nothing. But you knew he was down there. Started seeing him about a month after the storm. Just glimpses at first. Someone standing on the dock when I'd look out the lighthouse window. Gone by the time I got downstairs. Wet footprints leading from the water. Food disappearing from the kitchen. Henrik's hands shook slightly as he lit a cigarette. Then he started talking to me. Standing outside the lighthouse at night, calling my name, telling me about the others down there. All the boats that never made it home. He said they were building something, collecting the lost vessels, trying to create a way back to the surface. A way back? The drowned don't stay dead in these waters even. Something about the mineral content, the way the currents flow around the islands. Bodies get caught in underwater caves, preserved by the cold and salt. They keep thinking, keep remembering what they lost. And every few years, when conditions are right, they try to reclaim it. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of kelp and diesel fuel from the harbor. Henrik flicked his cigarette into the water. That's why the rules exist, to keep them down there where they belong. The salt burns them, confuses their navigation. The lighthouse beam shows them the way back to their underwater resting places. The third bolt on the door, that one's made from iron taken off a Spanish shipwreck from 1631. Blessed by a priest and carved with protective symbols. Old magic, but it works. What happens if someone breaks the rules? Henrik was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 1987. Young Coast Guard officer named Tommy Brennan took a temporary posting at the Lighthouse while I was in the hospital with pneumonia. Good kid, college educated, thought the rules were superstitious nonsense. He lasted 3 nights. What happened to him? Found him on the 4th morning, sitting on the dock with his feet in the water. Still breathing, but his mind was gone. Kept talking about swimming lessons. Said someone named Magnus was teaching him to breathe underwater. They took him to a psychiatric facility in Augusta. He's still there, far as I know. Henrik stood up, brushing cigarette ash off his jacket. The ones who come back aren't evil, exactly. They're just desperate. They remember being alive, remember what it felt like to breathe air and feel sunlight. They'll do anything to get that back, even if it means trading places with someone else. Trading places? They can't leave the water permanently. But they can swap. Take someone living down to their world. Use their body to walk on land for a while. That's what Magnus was trying to do with Tommy Brennan. What he's probably trying to do with you. We walked back toward the parking area in silence. Near my truck, Henrik stopped and pulled a small cloth bag from his pocket. Sea salt, he explained. Blessed by Father McKinnon at St. Bernard's. Keep it with you always. And whatever you do, don't let them inside the lighthouse. That's sacred ground. They can't enter without permission, but if you invite them in, even accidentally, the protections fail. How would I accidentally invite them in? By talking to them. By answering when they call your name. By opening the door when they knock. Henrik's eyes met mine. They sound like people you know, Ethan. They sound exactly like people you love. That's how they get you to break the rules. I thought about the phone call from someone who sounded like Kate. The conversation that never happened. About Magnus calling my name in the fog, using a voice that reminded me of my father. "Why didn't you tell me this when I took the job?" Henrik climbed into his old pickup truck, a rust-eaten Ford that looked like it barely ran. "Because you wouldn't have believed me. And because..." He paused, one hand on the door handle. "Because 42 years is long enough. I've done my duty to the family, kept the coast safe, followed every rule my grandfather taught me. Now it's someone else's turn." He started the engine and rolled down the window. "Those rules will keep you alive even, but they won't keep you sane. Nothing can do that, except getting out before they break you down." I watched his truck disappear into Rockland traffic, wondering if I'd just met my future. An old man driven to exhaustion by decades of fighting something most people couldn't even see. The carved boat in my kitchen felt heavier suddenly, like it was pulling me back toward the lighthouse whether I wanted to go or not. The carved boat had moved again while I was in Rockland. This time I found it sitting on the radio room desk, positioned so it faced the emergency frequency controls. A small puddle of seawater had formed beneath it, staining Henrik's old logbooks. I should have thrown the thing into the ocean immediately. Instead, I found myself studying the craftsmanship. Whoever had carved it possessed real skill. Every plank line was precisely detailed. The tiny reel house perfect in miniature. Even the name Astrid's Dream was etched in letters so small I needed a magnifying glass to read them clearly. That's when I noticed something else carved into the boat's hull. Numbers, barely visible scratches that looked like coordinates. I copied them down and checked them against the navigation charts in the radio room. They marked the position about half a mile southeast of the lighthouse, in deep water where the bottom dropped off into the Penobscot Trench. Not where my Mrs. Boat had been found, somewhere else entirely. The phone rang at 3:17 p.m. I answered without checking the caller ID, expecting Henrik or maybe Miriam from the store. "Ethan?" The voice belonged to my father. Same gravelly tone, same down east accent, exactly as he'd sounded 3 weeks before the heart attack. "You there, son?" My throat constricted. "Dad?" "Of course it's me. Who else would it be?" He sounded irritated, the way he got when I asked obvious questions. "Listen, I need you to do something for me." "Dad, you're..." I couldn't finish the sentence. Henrik's warnings echoed in my head. They sound exactly like people you love. "I'm what? Speak up, boy." The connection crackled with static, but his voice remained clear. Real, present. Every inflection matched my memories perfectly. "You died," I whispered. "4 months ago. Heart attack." Silence stretched across the line. Then, "That what they told you?" "Well, they got it wrong. I'm right here, son. Been trying to reach you for weeks. That lighthouse is interfering with the phone signals somehow." "Where are you?" "Down at the old mooring, where I always keep the boat. You remember, the spot near Ram Island where we used to set the traps together? I need you to come get me. Motor's acting up again." I knew the place he meant. Dad had worked those waters for 30 years, knew every ledge and current, but Ram Island was 10 miles north of here, and the coordinates on the carved boat pointed southeast. "I can't leave the lighthouse," I said, "not during duty hours." "Since when do you follow rules that closely?" Dad's voice carried a note of disappointment I remembered from childhood. "Always been too cautious, Ethan. Too worried about what other people think. Just like your mother." The mention of Mom hit like a physical blow. She died when I was 12, cancer taking her slowly over 2 years of treatments and false hopes. Dad never talked about her, couldn't handle the grief. For him to bring her up now, "I'll come get you," I heard myself say. "Give me an hour. Good boy. And Ethan? Bring some of that hot coffee from the thermos. It's cold out here on the water. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, trying to process what had just happened. Every rational part of my mind knew this was exactly what Henrik had warned me about. The drowned ones sounding like people I loved, trying to lure me away from the lighthouse's protection. But it had sounded so much like Dad. Not just the voice, but the mannerisms, the specific way he pronounced certain words. How could something that had been underwater for 45 years know details like that? I spent the next hour arguing with myself. Made coffee anyway. Filled the thermos Dad had always used when we went fishing together. Put on my jacket and walked halfway to the dock before stopping. The carved boat sat on the radio room desk like an accusation, its tiny prow pointing toward those mysterious coordinates. The sun was setting by the time I decided to call Henrik. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting. "They got to you," he said without preamble. "I can hear it in your voice." My father called, at least someone who sounded like him. Where did he say he was? Ram Island, but Henrik, he knew things, personal things that only Dad would know. "They learn," Henrik said quietly. "The longer they're down there, the more they absorb from the people they've touched. Magnus knows everything about me that I ever told him, plus things I never said out loud. Childhood memories, private thoughts, fears I kept hidden. After a while, the distinction starts to blur." So it wasn't really him? Does it matter? Whatever you heard, whatever you felt, it's designed to get you into the water. Don't answer the phone tonight. Don't answer the door. Don't even listen if they call your name. But they didn't wait for nightfall. At 6:43 p.m., someone knocked on the lighthouse door. 3 measured raps, pause, 3 more raps. The pattern Dad always used when he visited my apartment in Portland. I looked through the small window. A figure stood on the granite steps, wearing Dad's old fishing jacket and wool cap. Same height, same build. Same way of standing with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. But I couldn't see his face clearly. Shadows seemed to gather around his features, making details difficult to discern. "Ethan, open up. It's freezing out here." The voice carried perfectly through the heavy oak door. Dad's voice, no question about it. Tired, slightly hoarse from years of shouting over boat engines in Atlantic storms. "I know you're in there, son. Saw the light come on in the radio room." I pressed my back against the door, trying to block out the sound. Henrik's blessed salt felt warm in my pocket, but it didn't stop the voice from reaching me. "Your mother's here too." My blood turned to ice water. Through the window, I could see a second figure emerging from the shadows at the base of the lighthouse. Smaller, wearing a blue dress I remembered from childhood photographs. The figure moved with Mom's characteristic slight limp, the result of a riding accident when she was young. "Ethan?" Mom's voice, soft and warm, exactly as it had sounded during the good days between treatments. "We've been looking for you everywhere. We just want to talk." I slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, hands pressed over my ears. But their voices cut through everything. "We're not angry about the lighthouse job," Dad continued. "We understand why you took it. The money, the debt from my medical bills. You're a good son, Ethan. Always were. We're proud of you," Mom added. "Taking care of everything after we were gone. But you don't have to do this alone anymore. We can help you." The worst part was how real they sounded. Not just the voices, but the emotional undertones. Dad's gruff affection mixed with concern. Mom's gentle encouragement tinged with sadness. If I hadn't known they were dead, I would have opened the door without hesitation. The lighthouse keeper's job doesn't have to be forever, Dad said. There are other ways to handle the debt, better ways. But first you need to come outside so we can talk properly. I dozed off in the radio room chair sometime around 2 a.m., exhausted from hours of listening to my parents' voices pleading outside. When I woke 3 hours later, the lighthouse was completely silent. No footsteps, no knocking, no voices calling my name. The carved boat had moved again. This time I found it sitting on the windowsill, positioned so its tiny prow pointed directly at the emergency radio. Both miniature figures were gone from its deck. My hands shook as I checked the radio frequency. Nothing but static on the emergency channel. The lighthouse beam rotated normally overhead, and the weather instruments showed clear skies with light winds from the southwest. Everything appeared normal, but something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I made coffee and tried calling Henrik, but got no answer. Either he was still asleep or he'd turned off his phone to avoid exactly these kinds of calls. I couldn't blame him. After 42 years of this, he'd earned his peace. The sun rose at 6:23 a.m., painting the ocean copper and gold. From the lighthouse's upper windows, I could see the mainland clearly. Friendship's Harbor, the white steeple of the Methodist Church, even individual cars moving along Route 220. Normal life continuing just 3 miles away, close enough that I could probably swim to shore if the tide was right. But Henrik had warned me about leaving. The lighthouse was sacred ground, protected by old iron and older faith. Once I stepped outside those protections, the rules might not be enough to keep me safe. I spent the morning reviewing Henrik's notebook, looking for anything I might have missed. Most of the rules were straightforward, but Rule 7 had a note scribbled in the margin. Seagulls know things humans don't. When they flee, something big is coming, usually during new moon. I checked the calendar. Tonight was the new moon. The phone rang at 11:47 a.m. This time I let it go to voicemail, following Henrik's advice about not answering. But the message that played back made my stomach drop. Ethan, it's Kate. I'm at Dad's house going through his things, and I found something weird. There's a letter addressed to you, dated 3 weeks after he died. His handwriting, but that doesn't make sense. Can you call me back? My sister's voice sounded genuinely confused, not like the calculated mimicry I'd heard from the entities. But how could I tell the difference anymore? They'd learned to copy Dad and Mom perfectly. Why not Kate, too? I called her back from the lighthouse's landline, hoping the old copper wires might carry truth better than cellular signals. Kate? It's Ethan. Got your message about the letter. Oh good, you called back. This is really strange, Ethan. The letter is definitely Dad's handwriting on his personal stationery, but it's sealed and addressed to you at the lighthouse. How could he have known you'd be working there? What does it say? I haven't opened it. It's addressed to you, but there's something else. I found it in his tackle box, the one he always kept locked, along with some old photographs and a key I don't recognize. A key? My pulse quickened. What kind of key? Antique brass. Looks like it goes to a door or chest. Has some kind of symbol etched into the head. Looks like a lighthouse with waves around it. I knew what key she was describing. Henrik had mentioned it in passing during our conversation at the breakwater. Every lighthouse keeper received one, passed down through generations of keepers. It opened something in the lighthouse basement, something Henrik had never felt the need to use. Can you bring it here? I asked. Tonight? To the lighthouse? Even that causeway is underwater at high tide. I'd have to wait until tomorrow morning. Tomorrow might be too late. Kate was quiet for a moment. You sound scared. What's going on out there? How could I explain that our dead parents had spent the night outside my door, begging me to let them in? That I was seeing boats full of drowned fishermen calling for help on the radio? That carved miniatures of Mom and Dad had been watching me from a piece of driftwood? "Just bring the letter and the key," I said. "First thing tomorrow. And Kate, if I call you again today, don't answer. It won't really be me." I hung up before she could ask more questions. The afternoon passed slowly, each hour marked by the lighthouse beam's rotation and the steady crash of waves on granite. I found myself checking the windows obsessively, looking for signs of the seagulls' departure. They left at 4:17 p.m. Every bird on the island took flight within the span of 30 seconds, their cries echoing across the water as they fled toward the mainland. Gulls, cormorants, even the hardy guillemots that usually rode out any weather, all gone, leaving Burnt Island completely empty except for me. Rule 7. Trust the seagulls. When they all leave at once, something is coming. I secured all the lighthouse doors and windows, double-checking the third bolt and making sure my supply of blessed salt was within easy reach. Then I climbed to the lamp room to get a better view of the surrounding water. The ocean looked normal at first, dark blue under the cloudy sky, whitecaps stirred up by afternoon winds. But as I watched, the water began to change. Patches of luminescent blue-green appeared beneath the surface, growing larger and brighter as the sun set. By 7 p.m., the entire area around the lighthouse glowed like an underwater aurora. The phosphorescence pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves, as if something massive was breathing down there. Fish fled the area in silvery clouds, their panicked movements visible from the lamp room. The foghorn sounded once, its automated evening signal, but instead of the usual deep boom, it produced that mournful, whale-like cry I'd heard on my first night. The sound that meant something had answered its call. They rose from the depths at 8:23 p.m. Boats appeared in the phosphorescent glow, dozens of them, all moving in perfect formation toward the lighthouse. Lobster boats, sailing vessels, even what looked like a Coast Guard cutter from the 1940s. Each craft glowed with the same blue-green light, and each carried a full crew of figures that moved with the fluid grace of people who'd learned to walk underwater. Leading the flotilla was the Astrid's Dream, Magnus Johansson standing at the wheel like an admiral commanding his fleet. But he wasn't alone in the wheelhouse. 2 other figures stood beside him, my parents, exactly as they'd appeared outside the door the night before. The boats formed a circle around the lighthouse, their crews facing inward. Then, in perfect unison, they began to sing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a wordless harmony that seemed to come from the ocean itself. It reminded me of hymns from childhood church services, but deeper, older, like something that had been sung since the first humans looked out at the sea and wondered what lay beneath its surface. I found myself walking toward the stairs, drawn by the music. My feet moved without conscious direction, carrying me down from the lamp room toward the main door. The singing grew louder as I descended, more complex, with individual voices weaving in and out of the main melody. Mom's voice, Dad's voice, Kate's voice, though she couldn't possibly be down there. Even Henrik's voice, though I'd spoken to him just hours ago. The third bolt felt warm under my fingers. All I had to do was slide it back, open the door, walk down to the water where my family waited. They'd been calling to me for days, trying to bring me home. Why was I fighting it? The blessed salt in my pocket burned against my leg like a hot coal. The pain snapped me back to awareness, broke the song's hold on my mind. I jerked my hand away from the bolt, and stumbled backward into the lighthouse's central room. Outside, the singing stopped abruptly. Then Magnus's voice, amplified somehow so it carried clearly through the walls. "Ethan Thorne, you're the last keeper this lighthouse will ever have. Your family waits for you in the deep places where the water never gets warm. Join us willingly, and you'll see them again. Refuse, and you'll spend the rest of your life alone, knowing we're always here, always watching, always calling." The boats began to circle the lighthouse, their phosphorescent wakes leaving trails of light on the dark water. As they moved, the crews started chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Not English, not French, but something older that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to my bones. I retreated to the radio room and locked the door. Through the small window, I could see the underwater procession continuing its endless circuit. Some of the boats looked familiar, vessels I remembered from Friendship Harbor, fishing craft that had been lost over the decades. Others were older, much older, their lines suggesting designs from centuries past. How many people had the ocean claimed over the years? How many crews now served in Magnus's underwater fleet, preserved by cold water and in hunger that death couldn't satisfy? The carved boat on my desk began to glow again. This time, all the miniature figures had returned. Mom, Dad, and a third figure I recognized as myself. Tiny wooden Ethan stood at the boat's stern, one hand raised in greeting, the other holding what looked like a lighthouse keeper's key. On the radio, my own voice began speaking. "This is Ethan Thorne, keeper of Burnt Island Light Station. I've found the way home. The water isn't cold once you stop fighting it. Come join us. We're all waiting for you here." I turned off the radio, but my voice continued anyway, coming from the carved boat now instead of the speakers. Promising reunion with the dead, offering escape from loneliness and grief, painting pictures of an underwater paradise where no one ever had to say goodbye. Dawn was still 8 hours away. 8 hours of fighting voices that knew exactly what I wanted to hear. The underwater fleet circled until dawn, their phosphorescent glow fading as the first rays of sunlight touched the water. One by one, the boats sank back into the depths, taking their crews of drowned fishermen with them. Magnus stood at the wheel of the Astrid's Dream until the very end, his pale face turned toward the lighthouse like a promise of return. When the last vessel disappeared beneath the waves, I finally allowed myself to collapse in the radio room chair. Every muscle ached from hours of tension, and my throat felt raw from breathing the thick, salt-laden air that had somehow penetrated even the sealed lighthouse. The carved boat sat dark and lifeless on the desk, its miniature figures frozen in wooden silence. But I could swear they'd shifted position during the night. Now all three faced toward the basement door, their tiny hands pointing downward. Kate arrived at 8:30 a.m., her blue Honda Civic bumping carefully across the exposed causeway. I met her at the dock, grateful for the first human contact I'd had in days that didn't involve voices from the grave. "You look terrible," she said, studying my face with the concerned expression she'd inherited from Mom. "When's the last time you slept?" "A while." I took the manila envelope she handed me, feeling the weight of the old brass key inside. "Did you read the letter?" "I told you. It's addressed to you. Though I have to admit, I was tempted." Kate followed me up the path toward the lighthouse. Dad never mentioned anything about lighthouse keeping. I had no idea he even knew this place existed. Inside the lighthouse, Kate examined Henrik's notebook while I opened the letter. Dad's handwriting was shaky but legible, dated exactly 3 weeks after his death. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you've taken the keeper's job at Burnt Island Light. I hoped you wouldn't, but I know how those debts have been weighing on you. The Thorne family has obligations to this place that go back generations, though I never told you about them. Didn't want to burden you with ghosts that should have stayed buried. Your great-great-grandfather Joseph Thorne helped build that lighthouse in 1832. He also helped establish the protections that keep certain things from walking freely along the Maine coast. The Johansons weren't the only family entrusted with this responsibility. The Thornes served as emergency keepers when needed, backup guardians when the regular families failed. The key Kate found will open the door in the basement, marked with the lighthouse symbol. Inside, you'll find what we've kept safe for 5 generations. Use it only if the regular protections fail completely. The cost is higher than you know, but sometimes necessary sacrifices preserve the greater good. I'm sorry you had to learn about this duty after I'm gone. I'm sorrier still that I can't help you bear it. Trust the old ways, son. They've kept the coast safe for almost 2 centuries. Your father, Robert Thorne. P.S. Don't let them convince you that joining them is a mercy. The dead shouldn't rule the living, no matter how much we miss them. The letter shook in my hands. Kate read over my shoulder, her face growing pale. What does he mean, backup guardians? She asked. I don't know, but I think we're about to find out. I held up the brass key. Help me find that basement door. We located it behind a pile of old Coast Guard equipment. A narrow wooden door painted to match the lighthouse's interior walls. The lighthouse symbol was barely visible, worn down by decades of salt air and neglect. But the key fit perfectly, turning with the smooth click of well-maintained tumblers. The door opened onto a steep stone staircase that descended into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and led the way down, Kate following close behind. The air grew colder as we descended, carrying scents of brine and something else, something old and metallic that reminded me of blood. The basement was larger than the lighthouse's footprint should have allowed, extending back into the island's bedrock. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars containing unidentifiable specimens floating in murky liquid. Maritime artifacts covered every surface. Ship's wheels, anchor chains, figureheads carved from driftwood. Everything looked ancient, predating the lighthouse by decades or even centuries. But the room's centerpiece stood in its center. A stone altar covered in intricate carvings. Iron chains hung from its 4 corners, their links green with age but still strong. Dark stains covered the altar's surface, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Jesus Christ, Kate whispered. What is this place? Before I could answer, the lighthouse beam above us began flickering in patterns of 3. Rule 3. Turn it off for exactly 90 seconds, then turn it back on. I have to go upstairs, I told Kate. Stay here. Don't touch anything. I ran up 2 flights of stairs to the lamp room, my heart pounding. Through the windows, I could see the water around the lighthouse beginning to glow again. It was still daylight. The phosphorescence shouldn't be visible yet. But there it was, growing brighter by the moment. I turned off the lighthouse beam and started counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. That's when I saw them rising. Not just Magnus and his fleet this time, but individual figures walking up from the depths. They moved across the sea floor in slow procession, climbing the underwater slope toward Burnt Island's rocky shore. 23 Mississippi, 24 Mississippi. The first figure broke the surface at the dock. Magnus Johansson, exactly as he'd appeared in the old photographs, but with skin like wet marble and eyes that held no warmth. He stepped onto the wooden planks, water streaming from his clothes, and began walking toward the lighthouse. 47 Mississippi, 48 Mississippi. More figures emerged from the water. Men and women of all ages, all wearing the clothing they'd drowned in. Some recent, some from decades past. A few wore the colonial dress of fishermen from the 1800s, their coats and boots preserved by the cold Atlantic depths. 61 Mississippi, 62 Mississippi. I could hear them now, their bare feet on the granite steps, moving with the patient inevitability of the tide. No rushing, no urgency. They had all the time in the world. 87 Mississippi, 88 Mississippi. The lead group reached the lighthouse door. Instead of knocking, they simply stood there, waiting. Through the lamp room windows, I could see dozens more emerging from the water, forming orderly lines along the shore. 90 Mississippi. I switched the lighthouse beam back on. Instead of retreating, the drowned crowd looked up at the light and began applauding. Slow, rhythmic clapping that echoed off the lighthouse walls like rain on the tin roof. "Ethan!" Kate's voice came from the basement, tight with fear. "You need to see this." I raced downstairs, past the main level where the crowd waited outside, down to the basement where Kate stood beside the stone altar. The jars on the shelves were glowing now, their contents swirling in agitated patterns. "It started when the light went out," Kate said. "All of this stuff. It's connected to the lighthouse somehow." The altar's carvings were moving, shifting like living things. I could make out scenes of shipwrecks, drowning sailors, and what looked like ritual sacrifices. In the center, a carved lighthouse stood surrounded by stone waves, and tiny figures danced around its base. "Dad's letter mentioned sacrifices," I said. "The cost being higher than we know." That's when Magnus spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the lighthouse's thick walls. "Ethan Thorne, your family's debt has come due. 5 generations of Thornes have avoided their obligation. Tonight, one of you pays what's owed." Kate grabbed my arm. "What's he talking about?" I thought about the altar, the chains, the dark stains, about my great-great-grandfather helping to build the lighthouse's protections, about the cost of keeping certain things from walking freely along the Maine coast. The protections weren't just rules and blessed salt, I realized. They required blood, human blood, regular sacrifices to keep the drowned in their place. That's barbaric, but effective for almost 2 centuries. I looked at the altar's chains, designed to hold someone in place while the ritual was performed. Until Henrik's generation decided they'd have enough. They stopped making the sacrifices, started relying on rules alone. Magnus's voice grew louder. The rules were never meant to replace the old covenants, only supplement them. Henrik Johansson thought he could cheat death with iron bolts and table salt. But debts unpaid only grow larger with time. The basement door slammed shut above us. Kate ran up the stairs and pounded on it, but the wood didn't budge. We were trapped in the ritual chamber with whatever was coming next. "One Thorne dies tonight," Magnus continued. "The other lives to resume the true duties of lighthouse keeping. Choose quickly, or I'll choose for you." Through the basement's single small window, I could see phosphorescent shapes gathering outside. The entire population of drowned souls from 2 centuries of Maine shipwrecks, waiting to see which of us would pay the family debt. Kate looked at me, understanding dawning in her eyes. "No, Ethan. There has to be another way." But the carved figures on the altar were moving faster now, their tiny hands pointing toward the chains. And somewhere above us, footsteps echoed through the lighthouse as the dead came calling for their due. The basement door opened at exactly midnight. Magnus Johansson descended the stone steps, followed by 6 other drowned figures I didn't recognize. Water dripped from their clothes in steady rhythms, pooling on the floor around the altar. "Time to choose," Magnus said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Which Thorne pays the debt?" Kate stepped forward before I could stop her. "I'll do it." "No," I grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "This is my responsibility. I took the job. I should..." "Should what?" Kate's eyes blazed with the same stubbornness that had gotten her through nursing school while raising 2 kids alone. "Die because you tried to help the family? That's not how this works, Ethan." Magnus watched our argument with the patience of something that had waited 45 years for this moment. Behind him, the other drowned souls stood motionless, their pale faces reflecting the phosphorescent glow from the jars. "There might be another way," I said, studying the altar's carvings more closely. The lighthouse in the center wasn't just surrounded by waves. It was built on a foundation of bones. Human bones, carefully arranged in patterns that looked almost architectural. "What do you mean?" Kate asked. "The sacrifices weren't random. They were building something. Each death added to the lighthouse's foundation, made it stronger." I traced the carved figures with my finger. What if we gave them something else? Something more valuable than just one life? Magnus tilted his head, water streaming from his hair. "Speak." "The lighthouse itself, let it fall into the sea. Return the island to the drowned, and release the souls you've been holding here for centuries." The silence stretched so long, I wondered if I'd miscalculated. Then madness began to laugh, a sound like waves breaking on rocks during a winter storm. "You would destroy the protections that have kept us contained? Release every soul lost in these waters to walk the coast freely?" "You're already walking freely," Kate pointed out. "You're here, in a basement that shouldn't exist, demanding blood from the living. The protections failed the moment you stepped onto land." Magnus stopped laughing. Around the basement, the jars began to pulse with brighter light. "The lighthouse anchors us to this place," he admitted. "Binds us to its foundation through the blood that was spilled here. Without it, you'd be free to move on," I finished, "to whatever comes after death, instead of staying trapped in an endless cycle of hunger and revenge." The drowned figures behind Magnus began to murmur among themselves, not in English, but in the same ancient language I'd heard during their circling ritual. Magnus listened, then nodded slowly. "There is wisdom in your proposal, young Thorn. But the lighthouse's destruction must be complete. Nothing can remain that might anchor us to this realm." "What about the people on the mainland?" Kate asked. "If you're no longer contained here." "We want rest, not revenge," Magnus interrupted. 45 years underwater teaches you the difference. We'll take what you offer. Freedom to leave this place behind." I looked at Kate, seeing my own exhaustion reflected in her face. Neither of us had asked for this burden, this generational debt passed down through bloodlines like a genetic curse. But sometimes the only way out was through. "Do it," I told Magnus. The basement began to shake. Above us, the lighthouse beam flickered once, twice, then went dark forever. Stone dust rained from the ceiling as the building's foundation started to crack. Magnus and his companions were already fading, their phosphorescent glow dimming as the bombs that held them snapped one by one. "Go," he said, his voice growing distant. "You have perhaps 10 minutes before the structure collapses completely." Kate and I ran up the stairs as the lighthouse swayed around us like a ship in heavy seas. The basement door had vanished, replaced by solid stone. Behind us, the ritual chamber crumbled as 2 centuries of accumulated power released itself all at once. We reached my truck just as the lighthouse began its final descent. The ancient stonework folded in on itself with surprising grace, sliding into the sea as if it had always belonged there. The lantern room was the last to disappear, its dark lens catching the moonlight, once before vanishing beneath the waves. Standing on the mainland shore, we watched the phosphorescent glow spread outward from the submerged ruins. One by one, points of light rose from the depths and drifted upward into the night sky, freed souls finally able to continue their interrupted journeys. When the last light faded, the ocean returned to its normal dark blue. No more glowing water, no more voices calling from beneath the waves, just the eternal sound of waves on rocks and the distant cry of seagulls returning to reclaim their roosts. I never went back to Burnt Island. The Coast Guard installed an automated beacon on a steel tower anchored to the mainland, citing geological instability for the lighthouse's collapse. They offered me a transfer to another station, but I declined. Some debts once paid should stay settled. Kate moved back to Friendship and opened a small medical clinic. Sometimes, on foggy nights, she calls to check that I'm still breathing freely on dry land. We never talk about what happened in the basement, but we both understand that some family obligations end only when you choose to let them go. The carved boat still sits on my kitchen table in Portland. Empty now, its tiny crew finally at rest.